absolutely huge pleasure to welcome Hank Johnston here to the Democracy Seminars, and in particular to the strand in the Democracy Seminars that's Authoritarian Strands in Democratic Regimes, or as we call it, Democracy in Hard Places. So this isn't precisely about democracy, but it's about trying to make inroads within authoritarian regimes. Hank Johnston's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California at San Diego. And he's received several teaching awards, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Research Fellowship, various other honors. He's the founding editor and publisher of Mobilization, which is the journal in social movements, and I recommend it to you all. It's an extraordinary journal. He's recently edited the book, Culture, Social Movements, and Protest, and he's the author of forthcoming, is it out now? Protest, Contentious Politics in the State. It's out. With it's coming out soon with Oxford. Sorry, thank you. I ran into Hank because I work on the very small actions that people can take in social movements, even people who are not formal activists. Things like going and calling your boss a male chauvinist. I haven't published this stuff yet, but I've been working on it for a number of years. And I don't find that kind of thing in the social movement literature. And then I ran across Hank's Talking the Walk, which is about speech acts and resistance in authoritarian regimes. He's going to be talking about some of that today. And I just tripped out. I mean, I said, oh my God, here's somebody who's completely on my wavelength. I love this. And then I read the Let's Get Small, the dynamics of small contention in repressive states, and I was just saying, yes, yes. And then I read, in addition, a wonderful article called What a Good Idea, about the very concept of framing and how the framing theorists have sort of not quite got it right and have borrowed market analogies for social entrepreneurship analogies about selling frames and so forth, and actually got a lot of their ideas from the original ideology literature, but didn't make some appropriate distinctions which are made in this article, and talked in the article about ideology as idea work, that people sort of talk to one another, and one of the things they do in their talk is to make sense of the world, and if they're engaged in a social movement, they're trying to make sense of the world in terms of that social movement. They're moving along the ideas of that social movement. So the ideas that they come up with, the frames that they are to some degree self-generated, and then can become ideologies. This is different from, anyway, since this is exactly the way I'm thinking about things, it was another, oh my God, wonderful moment. So I never met Hank until 15 minutes ago. And,
that's true.
And I'm just delighted beyond words to be able to welcome you here to this strand of the Democracy Seminar. So, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As my kind introduction suggests, this is a topic that I've been interested in for some time, and in fact, it goes way back to field work that I did after my dissertation in Spain, and then later.
Hank, can we ask you to speak up? Some kind of heating system going on. You're competing with.
Or do we maybe, if who's around, do we have a little mic? Or is there, there's no mic.
Is there a way to turn off the heat?
We'll turn off the.
No, it's too centralized for us.
Would that
We don't have that.
be a good idea?
Try to turn off the volume. So I was saying that this is a topic that I've been interested in for some time, and that it's based on fieldwork, fascinating fieldwork in authoritarian regimes. I should say sort of a chicken, and so there are authoritarian regimes after the transition to democracy. So, but the imprint of years of repression were very apparent with the people that I spoke to. I've probably spoken to close to 200 activists in authoritarian situations. And the stories they tell of creativity, of risk-taking, of some fairly comical tales. It's refreshing that they can keep a smile on their face. In fact, maybe they have to keep a smile on their face when they face such risks. But this was fascinating. These are people that are heroes, and I don't, in a sense, I don't know where I would stand if I was in a place like that, situation like that. One Communist Party member had said to me, he said, look, I'm not a hero. I have a family, and I want to care for my family. So I was not an activist. And so I don't know where I would have been on this playing field of politics. But as I said, I found the creativity and the risk-taking and the heroics of these people very stimulating. And recently, but as this is work that I've done in the past, it's not a current strand of research, but most of the articles that have been mentioned here were published 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I'm pretty much done with that now. However, I've been thinking, I have been thinking about this again. And I've been thinking about it in terms of not so much the way that my presentation will unfold today, but I'm thinking about it in terms of the other side of the equation, and that is the state. And it makes me rethink some of the findings that I had, and rethink what's going on, seeing it through a slightly different lens. And what I have in mind here is that I've come to conclude that state authorities and state elites are aware of these small acts of repression. The focus of the presentation is going to be that these seek to go under the radar, but in rethinking some things that people have told me, there seems to be an awareness that these exist. This is pretty interesting. So that's a thread that I'm going to be weaving through this, and even though the ideas are not complete, maybe we can talk about them in a sense. Authoritarian regimes. This is a pretty interesting time to be talking about authoritarianism. So the seminar is very current. We have protests in Iran, the unfolding of a democratic movement and reactions by the state. In Venezuela, we've got we have a retrenchment of a democratic system, as Chavez just last week arrested the head of Global Visión, the main opposition television station, arrested a governor, an opposition governor in the state of Zulia. Of course, there's Russia. Of course, there's China. The contention with Google, the restrictions on the internet, and then there's Burma, and then there's North Korea. North Korea is fascinating. Perhaps some of you have seen the paper just last week of reporting of protests in North Korea. Probably North Korea is the most repressive regime in the world today. Maybe some might disagree with me, but Turkmenistan and Belarus, but North Korea, I'm sure you would agree that North Korea is right up there at the top. Yet, even in North Korea, protests occur. I was at a State Department conference 2 years ago in which we talked about North Korea, and I presented some of this material. And the State Department types and the CIA types that were there were in disbelief that this could never happen in North Korea. But the Koreans that were in the conference, who traveled to Korea, and maybe talk to family members, say, oh yeah, this goes on. This happens. So just 2 months ago, there were protests that occurred because of the currency devaluation. This is fascinating, and it raises two questions. First of all, from the point of view of social movements, is where did these protests come from? Because one thing we know in democratic regimes is that they come from pre-existing organizations, that people are recruited via networks that they belong to. So in a state like North Korea, where does a protest emerge? Or from where does it emerge? The other question is why in North Korea would a ruler ever want to make concessions to protest? This raises some fundamental questions about the nature of the state, the nature of the authorities, the nature of how they see their position. It questions the basis of totalitarian rule. Why would a totalitarian ever respond? In fact, in North Korea, they did rescind the policy against the markets. In North Korea, they to appease the popular discontent, an unfortunate event for the planner of this, but they executed them. So there was an elite response to these protests that developed. So a line of thought that I'd like to keep in mind today is that popular content is a background noise in the ears of authoritarian elites. That the kinds of protests that I'll be discussing today, although they seem to be under the radar, and indeed, as I developed these categories, thinking that they were under the radar, I'm beginning to think that the authorities are aware of them at different levels of state administration. What we have here is nothing that's especially controversial, but it's a social movement model of democratization in which you have civil society organizations exerting, articulating grievances, articulating interests that get represented in social movements, which then put pressures on state elites that can be considered, I guess I shouldn't use the mouse, that can be considered either outsider elites or established elites that are less responsive to reform. And it's through this back and forth, it's through this relationship at the state level that extensions of democratic reform occur. I listed here, according to Tilley's criteria of citizenship and equality and responsiveness and protection, which then open opportunities, open institutional organizational opportunities to liberalize the laws, and then at the top, change expectations. And those expectations then feed into public opinion, social movement potential, which then recursively keeps the process going again. And so when tentative first steps are taken towards democratization, it's quite common that it sets in motion a dynamic that moves step by step, 2 steps forward, perhaps 1 step back, but it's a model that is pretty, as I said, pretty non-controversial in terms of thinking about social movements. Now, this model, of course, is not that applicable in terms of authoritarian regimes. When we think of authoritarianism, a couple things need to be said. There's as there's no perfect democracy, there's sort of no prototypical authoritarian regime either. There's wide variation. Even within authoritarian regimes, there's a selective focus according to issues that people may raise. And authoritarian regimes are characterized by penetration into a civil society, which raises the first distinction that I'd like to make is that this means that communication that we take for granted in democratic forms of governance cannot be taken for granted in authoritarian regimes. It gives rise to what's been characterized by respondents that I've spoken to as a double-mindedness, that there's a public sphere and a private sphere. A public sphere where you speak regime talk, a private sphere where you can speak from your heart, speak more authentically, speak more truthfully. And then the other so keeping that in mind, I'd like to say one other thing about authoritarian regimes is that authoritarian regimes are not hermetically repressive in the sense that there is no room at all for appropriate to this seminar, no room for democratic expression. There are free spaces in authoritarian regimes, and this is where I'd like to go next. Free spaces in authoritarian regimes. Some of you may be aware of this concept. It was introduced in social movement theory to capture the idea that there were centers in modern democratic states where innovation in strategy and in thought and ideology occurred, where incubation of new ideas occurred, especially in the civil rights movement and in the women's movement. Of course, this notion takes on new meaning in authoritarian regimes. These are not nonprofits that are organized with charters and receive funding and write grants for foundation. In fact, the free spaces in authoritarian regimes are simply fascinating, and this is the main topic of my discussion today. I'll say one thing parenthetically, and that is that as we see in the development of protests in Iran and in other states, Russia and China, the presence of web-based technologies offers a whole new area of free space articulation, and it's a fascinating area of investigation for social scientists. Free spaces are creative. Their primary function is to permit communication to occur and to mitigate risk. So, at the very most microscopic level in authoritarian regimes, drawing upon discourse analysis theory and sociolinguistic theory, I have articulated this notion of an oppositional speech situation in which people gather together and are able to express that private sphere of talk in opposition to the public sphere of talk. Now, I have to read this. This was an article in the New York Times going back to North Korea. I'm sorry, it was in the LA Times back on March 25th, and it was interviewing refugees and interviewing migrant workers that go to China from North Korea. And people are outspoken They complained, said a 56-year-old woman from the border city of Busan, lowering her voice to a whisper. She said, "My son thinks something is going to happen. I don't know, but I can tell you this. People have their opinions. It's not like the 1990s when people just died without saying what they thought." So today there seems to be some opening of some oppositional speech situations in North Korea. As I say, oppositional talk is the most microscopic form of protest. There are several characteristics. They have a self-limiting quality in the sense that they are aware of their limits. A respondent in Estonia once told me how, as a young girl, she had learned this lesson very clearly. She had written in her notebook a poem that I think was poetic in Estonian. It doesn't translate that well. It said, "I am an Estonian. I am proud to be an Estonian I will ever be." And her teacher saw this and said, "Yes, Aile, this is very true, but we must never say this publicly." So, as school children, they're learning this distinction between public speech and oppositional speech situations. Slowly, one learns the rule-governed nature of oppositional speech situations. What you can say, what you can't say. An ongoing monitoring of who's present and whether they're trusted and what you can say. Sometimes symbolism and double entendre to measure the other interlocutors and to size them up as trusted participants or not. The point is that in authoritarian regimes, like the woman that I just quoted from North Korea, everyday talk is politicized. A Soviet joke nicely captures this, so indulge me as I read this. A young woman and her boyfriend were walking on a summer evening, and she heard the Song of the Nightingale in the background. She said, "Oh, the Song of the Nightingale. Don't you like the Song of the Nightingale?" And he replies, "I can say nothing until I know who wrote it." So this nicely captures the way that everyday interaction is politicized in authoritarian regimes. And of course, oppositional speech situations take on a quasi-institutional character that, for those of you who are familiar with the Soviet era, coffee shop talk, kitchen talk. This isn't limited just to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We see this, saw this in the Franco regime in Spain, and I'm certain that in China, I'm certain that in other authoritarian regimes like Burma, that the same process is at work.
So, hey, one question on the double entendre and symbolism. Is that also meant to be kind of to recognize membership in an oppositional group? So there's a
That's what I had tried to
so
explain.
kind of code.
Yeah. To gauge reaction, not so much to hide your feelings and to cloak them, but to gauge as you can see, this is a touchy business to kind of feel out where people are.
So you can always deny claim to have meant what the state wants you to mean.
Yeah.
So it's protected.
That's the idea.
There's the scene in the Manchurian Candidate when the bad guys, the woman says, "I believe in history," as a signifier that she's a Marxist. So is that the kind of thing that?
Yeah. Of course, in the Soviet Union,
it would be the other way.
Right. A scholar of Soviet discourse says this: consider the constant references to the kitchen as the most sacred place in Soviet society. There, over tea and vodka, people could speak their minds and tell stories and spill their souls openly. The Soviet state, of course, was the critical agent in this sacralization of private talk, since only in those quiet communicative exchanges did people feel they could communicate openly and honestly. And apropos of your comment, jokes are especially relevant because jokes are always deniable in the sense you can always say, but I was just joking. Can't you take a joke? But again, for those of you who may be familiar with Soviet society, jokes were an art form, and that they, and it's an interesting phenomenon in the sense that on the one hand it may perform a psychological escape valve. Jokes foster solidarity and goodwill, yet they're indirect and deniable, and we have those gatekeeping functions that we were talking about. The key idea then in oppositional speech situations is the mitigation of risk, but also, like everyday acquaintances, like our own friendships, there's a network quality to these nodes of talk as they occur throughout society. And that leads me to the next category that I've identified in my work, and that is the idea of duplicitous groups. Duplicitous groups. Or duplicitous, okay. Social and recreational groups. What was interesting in Spain, in the Estonian Republic, when I was there, was that people had no trouble identifying what groups carried a mild oppositional quality to them. These were commonly folk dancing groups, depending on what country you're in, jazz societies, foreign language groups, history groups, outing groups in Spain, in Barcelona, the Catalan equivalent of the Sierra Club was known as an oppositional center where they would have gatherings during the week and that oppositional talk occurred. These groups, interestingly, are often officially recognized. They're registered, they draw state resources. In Estonia, beekeeping societies, I still wonder at this, how beekeeping society took on this oppositional significance. I think it must have something to do with the fact that honey making was a private market exchange outside of the official economy. It harkened back to the period prior to World War II, during the Estonian Republic, and nevertheless, maybe it transcended maybe a cooperative agriculture, but people commented on that. Of course, in authoritarian regimes, it's quite common that churches and religious groups, not just Christian churches, but of course what comes to mind is solidarity and the role of the Catholic Church in the solidarity movement in Poland. I think that there's probably moral dimension to this, that the emphasis on dignity stands in opposition, that one finds in the world's faiths, stands in opposition to the authoritarian mode of governance, but also it's quite common that regimes will accord religious organizations a free space to draw upon legitimacy. This was, of course, the case in Poland. It was the case in Spain, the Roman Catholic Church, to a lesser degree in the Ukraine with the Union Church, in Armenia with the Armenian Church. In Burma, of course, the regime fully recognizes the oppositional potential of Buddhism there and represses it severely. But when monks retreat to the monastery, in a sense, they're in their free space. And so it's common that we have this linkage between, at least in the early stages of the democratic movement, the correlation between religious groups and churches. And then, of course, intellectual and cultural groups and artistic production. The artistic production stands in contrast to the constrictions that authoritarian state places, so it makes sense that many artistic workers will object to the restrictions of the authoritarian state. The examples here, of course, are well known. The role of Czech theaters in the Velvet Revolution, in the Soviet Union, the role of artists, the role of poetry, the role of certain novelists. And picking up that thread that I mentioned, censors play a role here. And I think that looking back on some of the interviews that I had, that I actually interviewed a couple censors who were artistic types. They were artists. They were members of the union. But they worked for the state. And one fellow in Estonia said to me that he sometimes let material pass, material that he felt that was just too obscure for the Russians to understand. It was too subtle. It also was because it was in Estonian, or when he actually said that when his superiors were on vacation, that then he could really help. Then he could really help the opposition. So you've got, now here's a person that drew their salary and their privileges from their position within the state, but you have a relationship with oppositional types that they're in symbiosis there. A well-known, now up to this point, we're still functioning under the radar. With the emergence of dissidents and dissident groups, we now begin to enter the public arena of challenges to regime policy. Prominent dissidents are often the artists that I talked about in the last slide, academics, public intellectuals. For many, their notoriety mitigates the risks they face, and sometimes can draw international pressures. Just last week, there was a woman in China was denied a visa because of her human rights activism to come here, and so her notoriety didn't stop that. But the point that I'd like to stress is that usually we think of dissidents in terms of the Sakharovs and Medvedevs, but dissidents is a network-based kind of activity. That is, it's a collective activity that behind and supporting the more prominent dissidents are networks of people who run greater risks, perhaps, and these functions that they perform that I list here, open letters and information function, discussions of history, petitions. These are labor-intensive works, and so the collective nature of dissidents plays a role in the creation of these islands of democracy in authoritarian regimes. And another form of increasingly public protests in authoritarianism is what I characterize as hit-and-run protests. These are sudden, they're public, and they make a statement to a broader audience. And like Dissidents, they're important in that capacity. Graffiti is common in authoritarian regimes. Graffiti, too, I want to stress that unlike tagging in the United States, graffiti seems to be a pretty social activity. Graffiti is common in Latin America. It was very common in Spain. It was widespread in the Soviet Union. Lookouts were necessary. In some complex artwork, several artists participated in the graffiti. So in a sense, graffiti is a collective action. It's a risk-incurring collective action. Clandestine placements usually take the form of nighttime symbolic actions, such as placing flowers, crosses, such as the flowers at the Gdansk shipyards. In Barcelona, there was a traffic circle where there was a statue of a historical figure in the Catalan nation named Rafael Casanovas. And the Franco regime tore down this statue, and every national holiday for the Catalan nation, you would find flowers being placed at the statue. Similarly, in the Soviet Union, this was the case in the Baltic states. The locations of the previous national heroes, the statues, one would find flowers being placed.
Even when the statues were no longer there.
The statues weren't there. The statues weren't there. But everybody knew what the meaning of this was. The one that I like the best is in Knaus, in Lithuania, where they had the prototypical statue of Lenin with his hand looking to the future, the socialist future, and his hand behind his back, and at night they would place a load of excrement on his hand. It's not done yet. They would place a loaf of bread behind his back. So the symbolism was quite clear what he was offering and what he was withholding from the people of Lithuania. The other kinds of other hit-and-run protests are event seizures, concerts. It's quite common that certain performing artists have an oppositional quality to their songs. Many times, even though they were prohibited to perform these songs, the audience would spontaneously sing these songs. And again, what's interesting here is that these are collective actions. These aren't spontaneous. In the cases that I've seen, activists would place themselves in a appointed time stand, and then the audience recognizes that this is an opportunity, that by virtue of their numbers, the police can't do anything. This is an opportunity to affirm their opposition, and they take advantage of that. Parodies of official events. Maybe some of you have heard of the Orange Alternative in Poland. This was a group of students that would paint themselves orange, but then they would go and parade on May Day and the anniversaries of the great socialist holidays, and lampoon the socialist slogans. Lenin lived forever, and of course the authorities could do nothing because they were saying exactly what they were supposed to say, but everybody, of course, knew that it was in a complete sarcastic vein. Sporting events, funerals, these are events that are often seized by the opposition and returned to their own ends. So here then we go back to the model, the social movement model that I had talked about earlier. Is this?
It's a pointer if you want.
What we have is listed here is the.
It gets absorbed by the screen.
Oh,
Yeah, it doesn't work.
never mind.
It's cool to
It's a nice
hold
thought,
it.
though.
Never mind.
Oh, wait a minute. You just made it work.
Yeah, only on, it doesn't work on
Oh,
the
I see.
screen.
Okay.
rarely flight.
That's okay, I can do without it. At any rate, what we have here is the various forms of opposition and the effect that these have on reform elites within the state, or authorities within the state, who stand in opposition to this group. Bunker elites, this is a term that was used in Spain to characterize the hardline phalangists that were in a bunker. They weren't going to change. And what happens, I'm thinking, is that this conflict within the state creates openings for uneven repression, which leads to small extensions of openness and the creation of yet more free spaces. And then we have this recursive relationship that I captured earlier in the other model, with the opening opportunities feeding back to these organizations, and actually the way that the actions of the organizations are perceived by the public and how they feed into public opinion. And we have this recursive relationship. So far, however, we haven't really entered the realm of what we would call modular social movement protests, demonstrations, strikes, marches. But these do occur in authoritarian regimes. And I have in mind social movements now that have a strong sense of the symbolic. In the truest sense of the word, manifestly about one thing, but also representing a much broader opposition to the regime, a proxy for direct political intention. In a sense, they model the coded opposition that is often found first in talk and then later in artistic production and songs that carry the strands of resistance. The kinds of movements that I have in mind are environmentalism, feminism, memorial campaigns. The vast campaign against the power plant in Limoges was well known. It was an environmental movement, but also it was an anti-Francoist movement. Environmental campaigns in the Soviet Union, in Estonia against a large movement against mining, was an opportunity for people within the state to throw their support behind some of the organizations that I had discussed earlier in that model that were mildly oppositional, but because it's about environment, but because it is accepted by the state as an appropriate expression of popular sovereignty. It enables elites to articulate mild opposition in a relatively safe environment. But as you can imagine, it also fosters the divisions within the more intransigent authorities and those who are more open to reform. At this time, at least in Eastern Europe, one begins to see the handwriting on the wall. So many people within the state are beginning to think about their futures and where the cards will fall 5, 10 years from now. So this game is now a game that feeds into divisions within the authorities of the state and begins to give yet more openings. And of course, then the final stage here is the creation of broad oppositional fronts. These are made up of many participants that took place in the modular protests that I characterize here, the feminist groups in the GDR, the environmentalists, the people that fought for some truth in the historical record of, for example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the Baltic states. These people then, as the movement begins to develop, as the democratic movement begins to develop, then take the lessons that they learned, lessons that are important because there's not a tradition of social movement organizing in these states. So in a sense, there's a kind of a linear progression here, and this linear progression is something that I've captured in this slide, in which you have on the one hand, you have kind of the state prevailing orientation towards protest and opposition at the top, and down here you have the agency, you have what the activists are doing, and there's the correlation between the level of openness and the kinds of protests here. This is a very kind of linear way of representing it. I think that I prefer this. Believe it or not, this morass of arrows and boxes. But the fact is that the progression of democratic, those islands of democracy in the authoritarian regime, it's not clean and it's not neat. It's quite messy and it's quite dynamic. And here we have social movements in the center. And again, that pressure on reform elites and the bunker elites, uneven repression, slow extensions of democratic reforms, still feeding back to more openings in society, and on the top, more expectations, democratic frames that feed back to both to public opinion and also feed back to the other organizations that exist. This model includes what I list there is the transmission belt organizations, that is the real official Komsomol, or the union organizations, which now at this point begin to, even them, they take on oppositional. And that's it.